Chapter 6. The Educated Negro Leaves the Masses. One of the most striking evidences of the failure of higher education among Negroes is their estrangement from the masses, the very people upon whom they must eventually count for carrying out a program of progress. Of this, the Negro churches supply the most striking illustration. The large majority of Negro communicants still belong to these churches, but the more education the Negroes undergo, the less comfort they seem to find in these evangelical groups. These churches do not measure up to the standard set by the university preachers of the northern centers of learning. Most Negroes returning as finished products from such institutions, then, are forever lost to the popular Negro churches. The unchurched of this class do not become members of such congregations, and those who have thus connected themselves remain chiefly for political or personal reasons and tend to become communicants in name only. The Negro church, however, although not a shadow of what it ought to be, is the great asset of the race. It is a part of the capital that the race must invest to make its future. The Negro church has taken the lead in education in the schools of the race. It has supplied a forum for the thought of the highly educated Negro. It has originated a large portion of the business controlled by Negroes, and in many cases it has made it possible for Negro professional men to exist. It is unfortunate, then, that these classes do not do more to develop the institution. In thus neglecting it, they are throwing away what they have to obtain something which they think they need. In many respects, then, the Negro church during recent generations has become corrupt. It could be improved, but those Negroes who can help the institution have deserted it to exploiters, grafters, and libertines. The quote-unquote highly educated Negroes have turned away from the people in the churches, and the gap between the masses and the talented tenth is rapidly widening. Of this, many examples may be cited. When the author recently attended in Washington, D.C., one of the popular Negro churches with a membership of several thousands, he saw a striking case in evidence. While sitting there, he thought of what a power this group could become under the honest leadership of intelligent men and women. Social uplift, business, public welfare, all have their possibilities there if a score or more of our highly educated Negroes would work with these people at that center. Looking carefully throughout the audience for such persons, however, he recognized only 2 college graduates, Kelly Miller and himself. But the former had come to receive from the church a donation to the community chest, and the author had come according to appointment to make an appeal in behalf of Miss Nannie H. Burroughs' school. Neither one had manifested any interest in that particular church. This is the way most of them receive attention from our talented tenth. Some highly educated Negroes say that they have not lost their interest in religion, that they have gone into churches with a more intellectual atmosphere in keeping with their new thoughts and aspirations. And then there is a sort of contagious fever which takes away from the churches of their youth others of less formal education. Talking with a friend from Alabama the other day, the author found out that after her father had died and she had moved to Washington, she forsook the Baptist church in which he had been a prominent worker and joined a ritualistic church, which is more fashionable. Such a change of faith is all right in a sense, for no sensible person today would dare to make an argument in favor of any particular religion. Religion is but religion, if the people live up to the faith they profess. What is said here with respect to the popular churches of Negroes, which happen to be chiefly Methodist and Baptist, would hold also if they were mainly Catholic and Episcopal, provided the large majority of Negroes belong to these churches. The point here is that the ritualistic churches into which these Negroes have gone do not touch the masses, and they show no promising future for racial development. Such institutions are controlled by those who offer the Negroes only limited opportunity, and then sometimes on the condition that they be segregated in the court of the Gentiles, outside of the temple of Jehovah. How an educated Negro can thus leave the church of his people and accept such Jim Crowism has always been a puzzle. He cannot be a thinking man. It may be a sort of slave psychology which causes this preference for the leadership of the oppressor. The excuse sometimes given for seeking such religious leadership is that the Negro evangelical churches are fogey. But a thinking man would rather be behind the times and have his self-respect than compromise his manhood by accepting segregation. They say that in some of the Negro churches, bishoprics are actually bought. But it is better for the Negro to belong to a church where one can secure a bishopric by purchase than be a member of one which would deny the promotion on account of color. With respect to developing the masses, then, the Negro race has lost ground in recent years. In 1880, when the Negroes had begun to make themselves felt in teaching, the attitude of the leaders was different from what it is today. At that time, men went off to school to prepare themselves for the uplift of a downtrodden people. In our time, many Negroes go to school to memorize certain facts, to pass examinations for jobs. After they obtain these positions, they pay little attention to humanity. This attitude of the educated Negro toward the masses results partly from the general trend of all persons toward selfishness, but it works more disastrously among the Negroes than among the whites because the lower classes of the latter have had so much more opportunity. For some time, the author has been making a special study of the Negroes in the city of Washington to compare their condition of today with that of the past. Now, although the highly educated Negroes of the District of Columbia have multiplied and apparently are in better circumstances than ever, the masses show almost as much backwardness as they did in 1880. Sometimes you find as many as 2 or 3 storefront churches in a single block where Negroes indulge in heathen-like practices which could hardly be equaled in the jungle. The Negroes in Africa have not descended to such depths. Although born and brought up in the black belt of the South, the author never saw there such idolatrous tendencies as he has seen under the dome of the Capitol. Such conditions show that the undeveloped Negro has been abandoned by those who should help him. The educated white man, said an observer recently, differs from the educated Negro who so readily forsakes the belated element of his race. When a white man sees persons of his own race tending downward to a level of disgrace, he does not rest until he works out some plan to lift such unfortunates to higher ground. But the Negro forgets the delinquents of his race and goes his way to feather his own nest, as he has done in leaving the masses in the popular churches. This is sad indeed, for the Negro church is the only institution the race controls. With the exception of the feeble efforts of a few all but starved out institutions, the education of the Negroes is controlled by the other element. And save the dramatization of practical education by Booker T. Washington, Negroes have not influenced the system at all in America. In business, the lack of capital, credit, and experience has prevented large undertakings to accumulate the wealth necessary for the ease and comfort essential to higher culture. In the church, however, the Negro has had sufficient freedom to develop this institution in his own way, but he has failed to do so. His religion is merely a loan from the whites, who have enslaved and segregated the Negroes, and the organization, though largely an independent Negro institution, is dominated by the thought of the oppressors of the race. The educated Negro minister is so trained as to drift away from the masses, and the illiterate preachers into whose hands the people inevitably fall are unable to develop a doctrine and procedure of their own. The dominant thought is to make use of the dogma of the whites as means to an end. Whether the system is what it should be or not, it serves the purpose. In chameleon-like fashion, the Negro has taken up almost everything religious which has come along instead of thinking for himself. The English split off from the Catholics because Henry VIII had difficulty in getting sanction from the church to satisfy his lust for amorous women, and Negroes went with this ilk, singing, "God save the King." Others later said the thing necessary is baptism by immersion, and the Negroes joined them as Baptists. Another circle of promoters next said we must have a new method of doing things and we should call ourselves Methodists, and the Negroes then embraced that faith. The Methodists and Baptists split up further on account of the custom of holding slaves, and the Negroes arrayed themselves on the respective sides. The religious agitators divided still more on questions beyond human power to understand, and the Negroes started out in similar fashion to imitate them. For example, 30 of the 213 religious bodies reported in 1926 were exclusively Negro, while 30, which were primarily white denominations, had one or more Negro churches among their number. In other words, Negroes have gone into practically all sects established by the whites, and in addition to these, they have established 30 of their own to give the system further complication and subdivision. The situation in these churches is aggravated too by having too many ministers and about 5 times as many supervisory officials as a church embracing all Negro communicants would actually need. All of the Negro Methodists in the world, if united, would not need more than 12 bishops, and these would have time to direct the affairs of both Methodist and Baptist in a united church. There is no need for 3 or 4 bishops, each teaching the same faith and practice while duplicating the work of the other in the same area, merely because a long time ago somebody following the ignorant oppressors of the race in these churches committed the sin of dissension and strife. For all of this unnecessary expense, impoverished Negroes have to pay. The quote-unquote theology of foreigners, too, is the important factor in this disunion of churches and the burden which they impose on an unenlightened people. Theologians have been the bane of bliss and source of woe. While bringing the joy of conquest to their own camp, they have confused the world with disputes which have divided the church and stimulated division and subdivision to the extent that it no longer functions as a Christian agency for the uplift of all men. To begin with, theology is of pagan origin. Albert Magnus and Thomas Aquinas worked out the first system of it by applying to religious discussion the logic of Aristotle, a pagan philosopher, who believed neither in the creation of the world nor the immortality of the soul. At best, it was degenerate learning based upon the theory that knowledge is gained by the mind working upon itself, rather than upon matter or through sense perception. The world was therefore confused with the discussion of absurdities, as it is today by those of prominent churchmen. By their peculiar reasoning, too, theologians have sanctioned most of the ills of the ages. They justified the Inquisition, serfdom, and slavery. Theologians of our time defend segregation and the annihilation of one race by the other. They have drifted away from righteousness into an effort to make wrong seem to be right. While we must hold the Negroes responsible for following these ignorant theorists, we should not charge to their account the origination of this nonsense with which they have confused thoughtless people. As said above, the Negro has been so busy doing what he is told to do that he has not stopped long enough to think about the meaning of these things. He has borrowed the ideas of his traducers instead of delving into things and working out some thought of his own. Some Negro leaders of these religions know better, but they hold their following by keeping the people divided, in emphasizing non-essentials, the insignificance of which the average man may not appreciate. The highly educated Negroes who know better than to follow these unprincipled men have abandoned these popular churches. While serving as the avenue of the oppressor's propaganda, the Negro Church, although doing some good, has prevented the union of diverse elements and has kept the race too weak to overcome foes who have purposely taught Negroes how to quarrel and fight about trifles until their enemies can overcome them. This is the keynote to the control of the so-called inferior races by the self-styled superior. The one thinks and plans, while the other, in excited fashion, seizes upon and destroys his brother with whom he should cooperate. Chapter 7. Dissension and Weakness. In recent years, the churches in enlightened centers have devoted less attention to dissension than formerly. But in the rural districts and small cities, they have not changed much, and neither in urban communities nor in the country has anyone succeeded in bringing these churches together to work for their general welfare. The militant sects are still fighting one another, and in addition to this, the members of these sects are contending among themselves. The Spirit of Christ cannot dwell in such an atmosphere. Recent experiences show that these dissensions are about as rank as ever. For example, a rural community in which an observer spent 3 weeks a year ago has no church at all, although 8 or 10 families live there. No church can thrive among them because, with 1 or 2 exceptions, each family represents a different denomination, and the sectarian bias is so pronounced that one will not accept the procedure of the other. Each one loves his fellow man if he thinks as he does, but if his fellow man does not, he hates and shuns him. In another rural community, where the same observer recently spent 2 weeks, he found a small and poorly attended Methodist church. Worshipping there one Sunday morning, he counted only 4 persons who lived in the community. Others might have come, for there was no other church for them in that place, but this particular church was not of their faith, and their number was too small to justify the establishment of one to their liking. The support given the unfortunate pastor there is so meager that he can hardly afford to come to them once a month, and consequently these peasants are practically without spiritual leadership. People who are so directed as to develop such an attitude are handicapped for life. Someone recently inquired as to why the religious schools do not teach the people how to tolerate differences of opinion and to cooperate for the common good. This, however, is the thing which these institutions have refused to do. religious schools have been established, but they are considered necessary to supply workers for denominational outposts and to keep alive the sectarian bias by which the Baptists hope to outstrip the Methodists, or the latter the former. No teacher in one of these schools has advanced a single thought which has become a working principle in Christendom, and not one of these centers is worthy of the name of a school of theology. If one would bring together all of the teachers in such schools and carefully sift them, he would not find in the whole group a sufficient number qualified to conduct one accredited school of religion. The large majority of them are engaged in imparting to the youth worn-out theories of the ignorant oppressor. This lack of qualified teachers in Negro schools of theology, however, is not altogether the fault of the teachers themselves. It is due largely to the system to which they belong. Their schools of theology are impoverished by their unnecessary multiplication, and consequently the instructors are either poorly paid or not compensated at all. Many of them have to farm, conduct enterprises, or pastor churches to make a living while trying to teach. Often then only the inefficient can be retained under such circumstances. Yet those who see how they have failed because of these things nevertheless object to the unification of the churches as taught by Jesus of Nazareth, whom they have all but ceased to follow because of their sectarian bias obtained from thumb-worn books of misguided Americans and Europeans. Recently, an observer saw a result of this in the sermon of a Negro college graduate trying to preach to a church of the masses. He referred to all the great men in the history of a certain country to show how religious they were, whether they were or not. When he undertook to establish the Christian character of Napoleon, however, several felt like leaving the place in disgust. The climax of the service was a prayer by another miseducated Negro, who devoted most of the time to thanking God for Cicero and Demosthenes. Here, then, was a case of the religion of the pagan handed down by the enslaver and segregationalists to the Negro. Returning from the table where he had placed his offering in a church on a Sunday morning not long thereafter, this observer saw another striking example of this failure to hit the mark. He stopped to inquire of his friend, Jim Minor, as to why he had not responded to the appeal for a collection. "What?" said Jim. "I ain't giving that man nothing. That man ain't fed me this morning, and I ain't feeding him." This was Jim's reaction to a scholarly sermon entitled "The Humiliation of the Incarnation." During the discourse, too, the minister had much to say about John Knox, Orthodox, and another of the communicants bowing at that shrine inquired of the observer later as to who this John Knox Orthodox was and where he lived. The observer could not answer all of the inquiries thus evoked, but he tried to explain the best he could that the speaker had studied history and theology. This was the effect this sermon had on an earnest congregation. The minister had attended a school of theology, but had merely memorized words and phrases, which meant little to him and nothing to those who heard his discourse. The school in which he had been trained followed the traditional course for ministers, devoting most of the time to dead languages and dead issues. He had given attention to polytheism, monotheism, and the doctrine of the Trinity. He had studied also the philosophical basis of the Caucasian dogma, the elements of that theology, and the schism by which fanatics made religion a football and multiplied wars only to moisten the soil of Europe with the blood of unoffending men. This minister had given no attention to the religious background of the Negroes to whom he was trying to preach. He knew nothing of their spiritual endowment and their religious experience as influenced by their traditions and environment in which the religion of the Negro has developed and expressed itself. He did not seem to know anything about their present situation. These honest people therefore knew nothing additional when he had finished his discourse. As one communicant pointed out, their wants had not been supplied, and they wondered where they might go to hear a word which had some bearing upon the life which they had to live. Not long ago, when the author was in Virginia, he inquired about a man who was once a popular preacher in that state. "He is here," they said, "but he is not preaching now. He went off to school, and when he came back the people could not understand what he was talking about." Then he began to find fault with the people because they would not come to church. He called them fogey because they did not appreciate his new style of preaching and the things he talked about. The church went down to nothing, and he finally left it and took up farming. In a rural community, then, a preacher of this type must fail, unless he can organize separately members of the popular Methodist and Baptist churches who go into the ritualistic churches, or establish certain refined Methodist or Baptist churches catering to the talented tenth. For lack of adequate members, however, such churches often fail to develop sufficient force to do very much for themselves or for anybody else. On Sunday morning, then, their pastors have to talk to the benches. While these truncated churches go higher in their own atmosphere of self-satisfaction, the mentally undeveloped are left to sink lower because of the lack of contact with the better trained. If the latter exercised a little more judgment, they would be able to influence these people for good by gradually introducing advanced ideas. Because our highly educated people do not do this, large numbers of Negroes drift into churches led by the uneducated ministers who can scarcely read and write. These preachers do not know much of what is found in school books, and can hardly make use of a library in working out a sermon, but they understand the people with whom they deal, and they make such use of the human laboratory that sometimes they become experts in solving vexing problems and meeting social needs. They would be much better preachers if they could have attended a school devoted to the development of the mind, rather than to cramming it with extraneous matters which have no bearing on the task which lies before them. Unfortunately, however, very few of such schools of religion now exist. For lack of intelligent guidance, then, the Negro Church often fulfills a mission to the contrary of that for which it was established. Because the Negro Church is such a free field, and it is controlled largely by the Negroes themselves, it seems that practically all the incompetents and undesirables who have been barred from other walks of life by race prejudice and economic difficulties have rushed into the ministry for the exploitation of the people. Honest ministers who are trying to do their duty, then, find their task made difficult by these men who stoop to practically everything conceivable. Almost anybody of the lowest type may get into the Negro ministry. The Methodists claim that they have strict regulations to prevent this, but their net draws in proportionately as many undesirables as one finds among the Baptists. As an evidence of the depth to which the institution has gone, A resident of Cincinnati recently reported a case of its exploitation by a railroad man who lost his job and later all his earnings in a game in a den of vice in that city. To refinance himself, he took an old black frock coat and a Bible and went into the heart of Tennessee, where he conducted at various points a series of protracted meetings which netted him 299 converts to the faith and $400 in cash. He was enabled thereby to return to the game in Cincinnati, and he is still in the lead. Other such cases are frequently reported. The large majority of Negro preachers of today, then, are doing nothing more than to keep up the medieval hellfire scare which the whites have long since abandoned to emphasize the humanitarian trend in religion through systematized education. The young people of the Negro race could be held in the church by some such program, but the Negro's Christianity does not conceive of social uplift as a duty of the church, and consequently Negro children have not been adequately trained in religious matters to be equal to the social demands upon them. Turning their back on medievalism, then, these untrained youth think nothing of taking up moonshining, gambling, and racketeering as occupations, and they find great joy in smoking, drinking, and fornication as diversions. They cannot accept the old ideas, and they do not understand the new. What the Negro Church is, however, has been determined largely by what the white man has taught the race by precept and example. We must remember that the Negroes learned their religion from the early white Methodists and Baptists, who evangelized the slaves and the poor whites when they were barred from proselyting the aristocracy. The American white people themselves taught Negroes to specialize unduly in the praise the Lord, hallelujah worship. In the West Indies, among the Anglicans, and among the Latin people, Negroes do not show such emotionalism. They are cold and conservative. Some of the American whites, moreover, are just as far behind in this respect as are the Negroes, who have had less opportunity to learn better. While in Miami, Florida, not long ago, the author found in 2 interracial holiness churches that the following was a third or fourth white. The whites joined wholeheartedly with the Negroes in their holy rolling, and some of them seemed to be rollers not holy. A few months ago in Huntington, West Virginia, where the author was being entertained by friends, the party was disturbed throughout the evening by the most insane outbursts of white worshippers in a Church of God across the street. There they daily indulged in such whooping and screaming in unknown tongues that the Negroes have had to report them to the police as a nuisance. The author has made a careful study of the Negro Church, but he has never known Negroes to do anything to surpass the performance of those heathen. The American Negroes' ideas of morality, too, were borrowed from their owners. The Negroes could not be expected to raise a higher standard than their aristocratic governing class that teemed with sin and vice. This corrupt state of things did not easily pass away. The Negroes have never seen any striking examples among the whites to help them in matters of religion. Even during the colonial period, the whites claimed that their ministers sent to the colonies by the Anglican Church, the progenitor of the Protestant Episcopal Church in America, were a degenerate class that exploited the people for money to waste it in racing horses and drinking liquor. Some of these ministers were known to have illicit relations with women and therefore winked at the sins of the officers of their churches who sold their own offspring by slave women. Although the author was born 10 years after the Civil War, the morals and religion of that regime continued even until his time. Many of the rich or well-to-do white men belonging to the churches in Buckingham County, Virginia, indulged in polygamy. They raised one family by a white woman and another by a colored or poor white woman. Both the owner of the largest slate quarry and the proprietor of the largest factory in that county lived in this fashion. One was an outstanding Episcopalian and the other a distinguished Catholic. One day the foreman of the factory, a polygamous deacon of the local white Baptist church, called the workmen together at noon for a short memorial service in honor of Parson Taylor. For almost half a century, the pastor of the large white Baptist church in that section, the foreman made some remarks on the life of the distinguished minister, and then all sang, "Shall we meet beyond the river?" But to save his life, the author could not restrain himself from wondering all that time whether the foreman's white wife or colored paramour would greet him on the other side, and what a conflict there would be if they happened to get into an old-fashioned hair-pulling. In spite of his libertine connections, however, this foreman believed that he was a Christian, and when he died, his eulogists commended his soul to God. Some years later, when the author was serving his 6 years apprenticeship in the West Virginia coal mines, he found at Nuttleburg a very faithful vestryman of the white Episcopal Church at that point. He was one of the most devout from the point of view of his co-workers, yet privately this man boasted of having participated in the most brutal lynching of the 4 Negroes who thus met their doom at the hands of an angry mob in Clifton Forge, Virginia in 1892. It is very clear then that if Negroes got their conception of religion from slaveholders, libertines, and murderers, there may be something wrong about it, and it would not hurt to investigate it. It has been said that the Negroes do not connect morals with religion. The historian would like to know what race or nation does such a thing. Certainly the whites with whom the Negroes have come into contact have not done so. Chapter 8. Professional Education Discouraged. In the training for professions other than the ministry and teaching, the Negro has not had full sway. Any extensive comment on professional education by the Negro, then, must be mainly negative. We have not had sufficient professional schools upon which we can base an estimate of what the Negro educator can do in this sphere. If mistakes have been made in miseducating the Negro professionally, it must be charged not so much to the account of the Negroes themselves as to that of their friends who have performed this task. We are dealing here then mainly with information obtained from the study of Negroes who have been professionally trained by whites in their own schools and mixed institutions. The largest numbers of Negroes in professions other than the ministry or education are physicians, dentists, pharmacists, lawyers, and actors. The numbers in these and other lines have not adequately increased because of the economic status of the Negroes and probably because of a false conception of the role of the professional man in the community and its relation to him. The people whom the Negro professional men have volunteered to serve have not always given them sufficient support to develop that standing and solidarity which will make their position professional and influential. Most whites in contact with Negroes, always the teachers of their brethren in black, both by precept and practice, have treated the professions as aristocratic spheres to which Negroes should not aspire. We have had, then, a much smaller number than those who under different circumstances would have dared to cross the line, and those that did so were starved out by the whites who would not treat them as a professional class. This made it impracticable for Negroes to employ them in spheres in which they could not function efficiently. For example, because of a law that a man could not be admitted to the bar in Delaware without practicing a year under some lawyer in the state, and no white lawyer would grant a Negro such an opportunity until a few years ago, it was only recently that a Negro was admitted there. Negroes then learned from their oppressors to say to their children that there were certain spheres into which they should not go because they would have no chance therein for development. In a number of places young men were discouraged and frightened away from certain professions by the poor showing made by those trying to function in them. Few had the courage to face this ordeal, and some professional schools in institutions for Negroes were closed about 30 or 40 years ago, partly on this account. This was especially true of the law schools, closed during the wave of legislation against the Negro, at the very time the largest possible number of Negroes needed to know the law for the protection of their civil and political rights. In other words, the thing which the patient needed most to pass the crisis was taken from him that he might more easily die. This one act, among many others, is an outstanding monument to the stupidity or malevolence of those in charge of Negro schools, and it serves as a striking demonstration of the miseducation of the race. Almost any observer remembers distinctly the hard trials of the Negro lawyers. A striking example of their difficulties was supplied by the case of the first to be permanently established in Huntington, West Virginia. The author had entrusted to him the matter of correcting an error in the transfer of some property purchased from one of the most popular white attorneys in the state. For 6 months, this simple transaction was delayed, and the Negro lawyer could not induce the white attorney to act. The author finally went to the office himself to complain of the delay. The white attorney frankly declared that he had not taken up the matter because he did not care to treat with a Negro attorney, but he would deal with the author, who happened to be at that time the teacher of a Negro school and was, therefore, in his place. At one time, the Negroes in medicine and correlated fields were regarded in the same light. They had difficulty in making their own people believe that they could cure a complaint, fill a tooth, or compound a prescription. The whites said that they could not do it, and of course, if the whites said so, it was true, so far as most Negroes were concerned. In those fields, however, actual demonstrations to the contrary have convinced a sufficient number of both Negroes and whites that such an attitude toward these classes is false, but there are many Negroes who still follow those early teachings, especially the quote-unquote highly educated, who in school have been given the scientific reasons for it. It is a most remarkable process that while in one department of a university a Negro may be studying for a profession, in another department of the same university he is being shown how the Negro professional man cannot succeed. Some of the highly educated, then, give their practice to those who are often inferior to the Negroes whom they thus pass by. Although there has been an increase in these particular spheres, however, the professions among Negroes, with the exceptions of teaching and preaching, are still on demand. In the same way the Negro was once discouraged and dissuaded from taking up designing, drafting, architecture, engineering, and chemistry, the whites, they were told, will not employ you, and your people cannot provide such opportunities. The thought of pioneering or of developing the Negro to the extent that he might figure in this sphere did not dawn on those monitors of the Negroes preparing for their life's work. This tradition is still a heavy load in Negro education, and it forces many Negroes out of spheres in which they might function into those for which they may not have any aptitude. In music, dramatics, and correlated arts too, the Negro has been utterly misled. Because the Negro is gifted as a singer and can render more successfully than others the music of his own people, he has been told that he does not need training. Scores of those who have undertaken to function in this sphere without adequate education then have developed only to a certain point, beyond which they have not had ability to go. We cannot easily estimate how popular Negro musicians and their music might have become had they been taught to the contrary. Of these, several instances may be cited. A distinguished man, talking recently as a member of a large Episcopal church, which maintains a Negro mission, mentioned his objection to the budget of $1,500 a year for music for these segregated communicants. Inasmuch as the Negroes were naturally gifted in music, he did not believe that any expensive training or direction was required. The small number of Negro colleges and universities which undertake the training of the Negro in music is further evidence of the belief that the Negro is all but perfect in this field and should direct his attention to the traditional curricula. The same misunderstanding with respect to the Negro in dramatics is also evident. We have long had the belief that the Negro is a natural actor who does not require any stimulus for further development. In this assertion is the idea that because the Negro is good at dancing, joking, minstrelsy, and the like, he is, quote-unquote, in his place when, quote, cutting a shine, and does not need to be trained to function in the higher sphere of dramatics. Thus misled, large numbers of Negroes ambitious for the stage have not bloomed forth into great possibilities. Too many of them have finally ended with roles in questionable cafes, cabarets, and nightclubs of America and Europe, and instead of increasing the prestige of the Negro, they have brought the race into disgrace. We scarcely realize what a poor showing we make in dramatics, in spite of our natural appetite in this sphere. Only about a half-dozen Negro actors have achieved greatness, but we have more actors and showmen than any other professionals except teachers and ministers. Where are these thousands of men and women in the histrionic sphere? What do we hear of them? What have they achieved? Their record shows that only a few measure up to the standard of the modern stage. Most of these would-be artists have no preparation for the task undertaken. A careful study of the Negro in dramatics shows that only those who have actually taken the time to train themselves as they should have finally endured. Their salvation has been to realize that adequate training is the surest way to attain artistic maturity, and those few who have thus understood the situation clearly demonstrate our ineptitude in the failure to educate the Negroes along the lines in which they could have admirably succeeded. Some of our schools have for some time undertaken this work as imitators of institutions dealing with persons otherwise circumstanced. Desirable results, therefore, have not followed, and the Negro on the stage is still mainly the product of the trial and error method. Several other reasons may be given for the failure of a larger number of Negro actors to reach a higher level. In the first place, they have been recognized by the white man only in purely plantation comedy and minstrelsy, and because of the large number entering the field, it has failed to offer a bright future for many of such aspirants. Repeatedly told by the white man that he could not function as an actor in a different sphere, the American Negro has all but ceased to attempt anything else. The successful career of Ira Aldridge in Shakespeare was forgotten until recently recalled by the dramatic success of Paul Robeson in Othello. The large majority of Negroes have settled down then to contentment as ordinary clowns and comedians. They have not had the courage, or they have not learned how to break over the unnatural barriers and occupy higher ground. The Negro author is no exception to the traditional rule. He writes, but the white man is supposed to know more about everything than the Negro. So who wants a book written by a Negro about one? As a rule, not even a Negro himself. For if he is really, quote, educated, he must show that he has the appreciation for the best in literature. The Negro author then can neither find a publisher nor a reader, and his story remains untold. The Negro editors and reporters were once treated the same way, but thanks to the uneducated printers who founded most of our newspapers which have succeeded, these men of vision have made it possible for the, quote, educated Negroes to make a living in this sphere in proportion as they recover from their education and learn to deal with the Negro as he is and where he is. Chapter 9. Political Education Neglected. Some time ago, when Congressman Oscar De Priest was distributing by thousands copies of the Constitution of the United States, certain wiseacres were disposed to make fun of it. What purpose would such an act serve? These critics, however, probably did not know that thousands and thousands of Negro children in this country are not permitted to use school books in which are printed the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution of the United States. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison are mentioned in their history as figures in politics rather than as expounders of liberty and freedom. These youths are not permitted to learn that Jefferson believed that government should derive its power from the consent of the governed. Not long ago, a measure was introduced in a certain state legislature to have the Constitution of the United States thus printed in school histories, but when the bill was about to pass, it was killed by someone who made the point that it would never do to have Negroes study the Constitution of the United States. If the Negroes were granted the opportunity to peruse this document, they might learn to contend for the rights therein guaranteed, and no Negro teacher who gives attention to such matters of the government is tolerated in those backward districts. The teaching of government, or the lack of such instruction, then, must be made to conform to the policy of, quote, keeping the Negro in his place. In like manner, the teaching of history in the Negro area has had its political significance. Starting out after the Civil War, the opponents of freedom and social justice decided to work out a program which would enslave the Negro's mind inasmuch as the freedom of body had to be conceded. It was well understood that if by the teaching of history the white man could be further assured of his superiority, and the Negro could be made to feel that he had always been a failure, and that the subjection of his will to some other race is necessary, the freedman then would still be a slave. If you can control a man's thinking, you do not have to worry about his action. When you determine what a man shall think, you do not have to concern yourself about what he will do. If you make a man feel that he is inferior, you do not have to compel him to accept an inferior status, for he will seek it himself. If you make a man think that he is justly an outcast, you do not have to order him to the back door. He will go without being told. And if there is no back door, his very nature will demand one. This program, so popular immediately after the Civil War, was not new, but after this upheaval, its execution received a new stimulus. Histories written elsewhere for the former slave area were discarded, and new treatments of local and national history in conformity with the recrudescent propaganda were produced to give whites and blacks the biased point of view of the development of the nation and the relations of the races. Special treatments of the Reconstruction period were produced in apparently scientific form by propagandists who went into the first graduate schools of the East to learn modern historiography about half a century ago. Having the stamp of science, the thought of these polemics was accepted in all seats of learning. These rewriters of history fearlessly contended that slavery was a benevolent institution. The masters loved their slaves and treated them humanely. The abolitionists meddled with the institution, which the masters eventually would have modified. The Civil War, brought about by quote-unquote fanatics like William Lloyd Garrison and John Brown, was unnecessary. It was a mistake to make the Negro a citizen, for he merely became worse off by incurring the displeasure of the master class that will never tolerate him as an equal. And the Negro must live in this country in a state of recognized inferiority. Some of these theories may seem foolish, but historians even in the North have been won to this point of view. They ignore the recent works of Miss Elizabeth Donen, Mrs. H.T. Catterall, and Dr. Frederick Bancroft, who have spent years investigating slavery and slave trading. These are scientific productions with the stamp of the best scholarship in America. Treatises produced from such genuine documents as the court records of the slaveholding section itself, and these authors have rendered the public a valuable service in removing the whitewash which pseudo-historians have been giving to slavery and slaveholders for more than a century. In the preparation of Negroes, many of whom teach in the South, these biased Northern historians even convert them to such a faith. A few years ago, the author happened to listen to a conversation of Negro lawyers in one of our southern cities, in which they unanimously conceded practically every contention set forth in this program of propaganda. They denounced, therefore, all Reconstructionists who advocated equality and justice for all. These Negroes had the biased point of view of the rewriters like Claude Bowers, and had never been directed to the real history of that drama as set forth by A. Taylor, Francis B. Simpkins, and Robert H. Woody of the New Southern School of Thought. These Negro critics were especially hard on Negroes of our day who engaged in agitation for actual democracy. Negroes themselves in certain parts joined with the whites. Then, in keeping out of the schools teachers who may be bold enough to teach the truth as it is. They usually say the races here are getting along amicably now, and we do not want these peaceful relations disturbed by the teaching of new political thought. What they mean to say with respect to the peaceful relation of the races, then, is that the Negroes have been terrorized to the extent that they are afraid even to discuss political matters publicly. There must be no exposition of the principles of government in the schools, and this must not be done in public among Negroes with a view to stimulating political activity. Negroes engaged in other spheres in such communities finally come to the point of accepting silence on these matters as a fixed policy, knowing that action to the contrary means mob rule which may destroy the peace and property of the community. They constitute themselves a sort of vigilant committee to direct their fellows accordingly. A few years ago, a rather youthful-looking high school principal in one of the large cities was unceremoniously dismissed because he said jocosely to the president of the Board of Education in reply to his remark about his youthful bearing, quote, "I am old enough to vote." "Horrors," said the infuriated official. "Put him out. We brought him here to teach these Negroes how to work, and here he is thinking about voting." A few prominent Negroes of the place muttered a little, but they did nothing effective to correct this injustice. In certain parts, therefore, the Negroes under such terrorism have ceased to think of political matters as their sphere. Where such things come into the teaching in more advanced work, they are presented as matters of concern to a particular element rather than as functions in which all citizens may participate. The result is that Negroes grow up without knowledge of political matters which should concern all elements. To prevent the Negroes from learning too much about these things, the whites in the schools are sometimes neglected also, but the latter have the opportunity to learn by contact, close observation, and actual participation in the affairs of government. Negroes in certain parts, then, have all but abandoned voting even at points where it might be allowed. In some cases, not as many as 2,000 Negroes vote in a whole state. By special legislation providing for a literacy test and the payment of taxes, their number of voters has been reduced to a negligible quantity, and the few who can thus function do not do so because they are often counted out when they have the deciding vote. The tests established for the restriction of suffrage were not intended to stimulate political education, but to eliminate the Negro vote by subterfuge. Negroes presenting themselves for registration are asked to do the all but impossible thing of expounding parts of the Constitution which have baffled high courts, but whites are asked simple questions which almost any illiterate man can answer. In this way the Negroes, however intelligent, are turned down, and all ignorant whites are permitted to vote. These laws, then, have retarded rather than stimulated the political education of both races. Such knowledge is apparently useless for Negroes and unnecessary for the whites, for the Negroes do not immediately profit by having it, and the whites may function as citizens without it. The effect of such a one-sided system is decidedly bad. One does not realize it until he talks with men and women of these districts, who because of the denial of these privileges have lost interest in political matters. A book agent working in the plantation area of Mississippi tested the knowledge of Negroes of these matters by asking them questions about the local and state government. He discovered that they knew practically nothing in this sphere. It was difficult to find any who knew who was President of the United States. One meets teachers, physicians, and ministers who do not know the ordinary operations of courts, the functions of the counsel, jury, or judge, unless such knowledge has come by the bitter experience of having been imposed upon by some tribunal of injustice. Some of the, quote, educated Negroes do not pay attention to such important matters as the assessment of property and the collection of taxes, and they do not inform themselves as to how these things are worked out. An influential Negro in the South, then, is one who has nothing to do or say about politics and advises others to follow the same course. The elimination of the Negro from politics, then, has been most unfortunate. The whites may have profited thereby temporarily, but they showed very little foresight. How the whites can expect to make of the Negroes better citizens by leading them to think they should have no part in the government of this country is a mystery. To keep a man above vagabondage and crime, he needs, among other things, the stimulus of patriotism. But how can a man be patriotic when the effect of his education is to the contrary? What little chance the Negro has to learn by participation in politics in most parts of the South is unfortunately restricted now to corruption. The usual stir about electing delegates to the National Republican Convention from the Southern states and the customary combat the Negroes have with lily-white corruptionists are about all the political matters which claim their attention in the Lower South. Neither the white nor the black faction, as a rule, makes any effort to restore suffrage to Negroes. The objective is merely the control of delegates and federal patronage for the financial considerations involved. To do this, they resort to numerous contests, culminating in closing hotels and bolting doors for secret meetings. Since this is the only activity in which Negroes can participate, they have learned to look upon it as honorable. Large numbers of Negroes become excited over the contest and give much publicity to it on the rostrum and in the press as a matter of great importance. The methods of these corruptionists of both races, however, should be condemned as a disgrace to the state and nation. Instead of doing something to get rid of this ilk, however, we find the highly educated Negroes trying to plunge also into the mire. One of the most discouraging aspects in Negro life recently observed was that of a presidential campaign. Prominent Negroes connected with 3 of our leading institutions of learning temporarily abandoned their work to round up Negro votes for one of the candidates. The objective, of course, was to control the few ordinary jobs which are allotted to Negro politicians for their campaign services. When the successful candidate had been inaugurated, however, he carefully ignored them in the makeup of the personnel of his administration and treated Negroes in general with contempt. When you think of the fact that the Negroes who are being thus used are supposedly the most reputable Negro leaders and our most highly educated men, you have to wonder whether the Negro has made any progress since emancipation. The only consolation one can get out of it is that they may not represent the whole race. In the North, the Negroes have a better chance to acquire knowledge of political matters of the simple kind, but the bosses do not think it is advisable to enlighten them thoroughly. Negroes in parts are employed in campaigns, but they are not supposed to discuss such issues of the day as free trade, tariff for protection, the World Court, and the League of Nations. These Negro workers are supposed to tell their people how one politician seeking office has appointed more Negro messengers or charwomen in the service than the other, or how the grandfather of the candidate stood with Lincoln and Grant through their ordeal and thus brought the race into its own. Another important task of these Negroes thus employed is also to abuse the opposing party, showing how hostile it has been to the Negro while the highly favorable party was doing so much for the race. The course of these bosses has been interesting. At first, the white man used the Negro leader by giving him a drink occasionally. The next step was to give him sufficient money to set up drinks in the name of the white candidate. When drinking at the expense of the candidate became too common, the politicians fell back on the distribution of funds in small amounts. When this finally proved to be insufficient, however, the politicians had to go a bit further and provide Jim Crow jobs in certain back rooms with the understanding that the functions of the so-called office would be merely nominal, and the incumbents would have no close contact with white people. In this stage, the Negroes find themselves today. The undesirable aspect of the affair is that the Negro, in spite of the changes from one method of approach to that of another, is never brought into the inner circle of the party with which he is affiliated. He is always kept on the outside and is used as a means to an end. To obtain the meager consideration which he receives, the Negro must work clandestinely through the back door. It has been unnecessary for the white man to change this procedure, for until recent years he has generally found it possible to satisfy the majority of Negroes with the few political positions earmarked as quote-unquote Negro jobs and to crush those who clamor for more recognition. It is unfortunate, too, that such a large number of Negroes do not know any better than to stake their whole fortune on politics. History does not show that any race, especially a minority group, has ever solved an important problem by relying altogether on one thing, certainly not by parking its political strength on one side of the fence because of empty promises. There are Negroes who know better, but such thinkers are kept in the background by the traducers of the race to prevent the enlightenment of the masses. The misleading politicians are the only persons through whom the traducers act with respect to the Negro, and there are always a sufficient number of mentally undeveloped voters who will supply them a large following. Even the few Negroes who are elected to office are often similarly uninformed and show a lack of vision. They have given little attention to the weighty problems of the nation, and in the legislative bodies to which they are elected, they restrict themselves as a rule to matters of special concern to the Negroes themselves, such as lynching, segregation, and disenfranchisement, which they have well learned by experience. This indicates a step backwards, for the Negroes who sat in Congress and in the state legislatures during the Reconstruction worked for the enactment of measures of concern to all elements of the population, regardless of color. Historians have not yet forgot what those Negro statesmen did in advocating public education, internal improvements, labor arbitration, the tariff, and the merchant marine. Chapter 10. The Loss of Vision. History shows, then, that as a result of these unusual forces in the education of the Negro, he easily learns to follow the line of least resistance rather than battle against odds for what real history has shown to be the right course. A mind that remains in the present atmosphere never undergoes sufficient development to experience what is commonly known as thinking. No Negro thus submerged in the ghetto, then, will have a clear conception of the present status of the race or sufficient foresight to plan for the future, and he drifts so far toward compromise that he loses moral courage. The education of the Negro, then, becomes a perfect device for control from without. Those who purposely promote it have every reason to rejoice, and Negroes themselves exultingly champion the cause of the oppressor. A comparison of the record of the spokesmen of the race today with that of those of the 18th century shows a moral surrender. During the prolonged struggle between the French and English in America, the Negroes held the balance of power at several strategic points and used it accordingly. Today, the Negro finds himself inconsequential because he can be parked on one side of the fence. The same balance of power was evident also during the American Revolution, when Negro soldiers insisted on serving side by side with others. Today, many Negroes are content as menials in the army. At that time, Negroes preached to mixed congregations. Today we find the Negroes busy separating them. The 18th century Negro resented any such thing as social distinctions. Today, Negroes are saying that they do not want social equality. Negroes of that epoch said with the ancient poet, quote, "I am a man, and deem nothing that relates to man a matter of indifference to me," end quote. Today, however, the average Negro says, quote, "Now I am a colored man, and you white folks must settle that matter among yourselves," end quote. At a still later date, the American Negro showed more courage than he does today with all of his so-called enlightenment. When the free Negroes were advised 100 years ago to go to Africa, They replied that they would never separate themselves from the slave population of this country, as they were brethren by the ties of consanguinity, of suffering, and of wrong. Today, however, the Negro in the North turns up his nose at the crude migrant from the South who brings to the North the race problem, but along with it more thrift and actual progress than the Northern Negro ever dreamed of. When, again in 1816, free Negroes like Richard Allen, James Forten, and Robert Purvis were referred to as a foreign element whose social status might not be secure in this country, instead of permitting the colonialists to shove them aside as criminals to be deported to a distant shore, they replied in no uncertain terms that this soil in America which gave them birth is their only true home. Quote, "Here their fathers fought, bled, and died for this country, and here they intended to stay." End quote. Today, when such things come up, you find Negroes appearing upon the scene to see how much pay they can obtain to assist in the proposed undoing of the race. Further emphasizing this thought of resistance a few years later, Nathaniel Paul, a Baptist preacher of Albany, informed the colonialists that free Negroes would not permit their traducers to formulate a program for the race. "You may go ahead with your plan to deport this element in order to make slavery secure," he warned, "but the free Negroes will never emigrate to Africa. We shall stay here and fight until the foul monster is crushed. Slavery must go." "Did I believe it would always continue?" said he. "And that man to the end of time would be permitted with impunity to usurp the same undue authority over his fellow. I would disavow any allegiance or obligation I was under to my fellow creatures, or any submission that I owed to the laws of my country. I would deny the superintending power of divine providence in the affairs of this life. I would ridicule the religion of the Savior of the world, and treat as the worst of men the ministers of the everlasting gospel. I would consider my Bible as a book of false and delusive fables, and commit it to the flames. Nay, I would still go farther. I would at once confess myself an atheist, and deny the existence of a holy God." And these Negroes of a century ago stood their ground, and fought the pro-slavery deportationalists to a standstill. For with the exception of a few pioneers, the emigrants to Liberia were largely slaves manumitted on the condition that they would settle in Africa. These freedmen, then, could have no ideals but those of the slave-holding section from which they were sent. They established, therefore, a slavocracy in Liberia. If Liberia has failed, then, it is no evidence of the failure of the Negro in government. It is merely evidence of the failure of slavery. The Negroes attacking Jim Crowism almost a century ago fearlessly questioned the constitutionality of such a provision. Speaking through Charles Lennox Raymond of that day, they said, quote, "There is a distinction between social and civil rights. We all claim the privilege of selecting our society and associations, but in civil rights, one man has not the prerogative to define rights for another. These race distinctions react in all their wickedness, to say nothing of their concocted and systematized odiousness and absurdity, upon those who are illiberal and mean enough to practice them." In our day, however, we find some, quote, highly educated Negroes approving such Jim Crowism. For example, not many years ago, an outstanding Baptist preacher, dabbling in politics in West Virginia, suggested to the whites that they enact a Jim Crow car law in that state, and we had difficulty in crushing that sentiment. A few years thereafter, the author heard one of our bishops say that we should not object to such separation, for we want to be by ourselves. When this distinguished churchman died, the traducers of the Negro lauded him to the skies, and thoughtless members of the race, thinking that he deserved it, joined in the loud acclaim. In this way, the large majority of educated Negroes in the United States have accepted segregation and have become its fearless champions. Their filled but undeveloped minds do not enable them to understand that although an opiate furnishes temporary relief, it does not remove the cause of the pain. In this case, we have yielded on principle to satisfy the mob, but have not yet found an ultimate solution of the problem at hand. In our so-called democracy, we are accustomed to give the majority what they want rather than educate them to understand what is best for them. We do not show the Negro how to overcome segregation, but we teach him how to accept it as final and just. Numerous results from this policy may be cited. The white laboring man refuses to work with Negroes because of the false tradition that the Negro is an inferior, and at the same time the Negro, for the same reason, becomes content with menial service and drudgery. The politician excludes the Negro from the councils of his party and from the government because he has been taught that such is necessary to maintain the supremacy of his race. The Negro, trained in the same school of thought, accepts this as final and contends for such meager consideration as the bosses may begrudgingly grant him. An irate resident in an exclusive district protests against an invasion by Negroes because he has learned that these poverty-stricken people are carriers of disease and agents of crime. The Negroes, believing that such is the truth, remain content in the ghetto. The irrational parent forces the separation of the races in some school because his child must occupy a seat next to a pupil of, quote, tainted African blood. The educated Negro accepts this as inevitable and welcomes the makeshift for his people. Children of Negroes are excluded from the playgrounds because of the assertion that they will contaminate those of the whites. The Negroes, yielding, settle down to a policy of having their children grow up in neglected fashion in the most undesirable part of the city. The Negro is forced to ride in a Jim Crow car to stamp upon him more easily the badge of his inferiority. The educated Negro accepts it as settled and abandons the fight against this social prescription. And thus goes segregation, which is the most far-reaching development in the history of the Negro since the enslavement of the race. In fact, it is a sequel of slavery. It has been made possible by our system of miseducating innocent people who did not know what was happening. It is so subtle that men have participated in promoting it without knowing what they were doing. There are a few defenders of segregation who are doubtless sincere. Although nominally free, they have never been sufficiently enlightened to see the matter other than as slaves. One can cite cases of Negroes who opposed emancipation and denounced the abolitionists. A few who became free re-enslaved themselves. A still larger number made no effort to become free because they did not want to disconnect themselves from their masters, and their kind still object to full freedom. Ever since the Civil War, when Negroes were first given a chance to participate in the management of their affairs, they have been inconsistent and compromising. They have tried to gain one thing on one day by insisting on equality for all, while at the same time endeavoring to gain another point the next day by segregation. At one moment, Negroes fight for the principle of democracy, and at the very next moment, they barter it away for some temporary advantage. You cannot have a thing and dispose of it at the same time. For example, the Negro political leaders of the Reconstruction period clamored for suffrage and the right of holding office, serving in the militia, and sitting on the jury. But few of them wanted white and colored children to attend the same school. When expressing themselves on education, most of them took the position of segregationists. And Charles Sumner, in his fight for the civil rights of the Negro, had to eliminate mixed schools from his program, not only because whites objected, but also because the Negroes themselves did not seem to want them. All of these leaders might not have been looking for jobs in those days, but as nominal freemen who were still slaves, they did not feel comfortable in the presence of their former masters. These timorous men were very much like some Negroes who were employed near the author's home in Virginia by a northern farmer who had moved into the state after the Civil War. When breakfast time came the first morning, he called them in to eat at the table with his family. These actual slaves, however, immediately lost their appetite. One finally called the employer aside and settled the matter in another way. He said, quote, "Now, boss, you ain't used to the rules of this country. We just can't sit at the table with white folk. We've been used to eating a cake of bread out yonder between the plow handles. Let us go out there." End quote. The system, therefore, has extended from one thing to another until the Negroes today find themselves hedged in by the color bar almost every way they turn, and, set off by themselves, the Negroes cannot learn from the example of others with whom they might come into contact. In the ghetto, too, they are not permitted to construct and carry out a program of their own. These segregating institutions interfere with the development of self-help among Negroes. For often Negroes fail to raise money to establish institutions which they might control, but they readily contribute large sums for institutions which segregate persons of African blood. Denied participation in the higher things of life, the educated Negro himself joins too with ill-designing persons to handicap his people by systematized exploitation. Feeling that the case of the Negro is hopeless, the educated Negro decides upon the course of personally profiting by whatever he can do in using these people as a means to an end. He grins in their faces while extracting money from them, but his heart shows no fond attachment to their despised cause. With a little larger income than they receive, he can make himself somewhat comfortable in the ghetto, and he forgets those who have no way of escape. Some of this educated class join with unprincipled real estate men in keeping Negroes out of desirable parts of the city and confining them to unsanitary sections. Such persons help the profiteer to collect from Negroes, thus cornered, a larger rental than that exacted from whites for the same property. In similar fashion, a Negro minister sometimes goes into a community where the races are moving along amicably together in their churches and rents a shack or an old empty store to start a separate church for quote-unquote our people, not to supply any practical need, but to exploit those who have never learned to think. Professional men, too, walking in their footsteps, impose also upon the poor innocent Negroes who do not know when they are being treated properly and when they are not, but high fees may be obtained from them inasmuch as they cannot always go to others for service. Settling in a community with mixed schools, the educated Negro often advocates this separation that his daughter may secure a position in the system. The Negro politician is accustomed to corner the Negro vote by opening a separate office from which he may bargain with the chieftains of the machine for the highest price available. When paid off by some position, which is not very lofty, this office holder accepts such employment with the understanding that he will be set off by himself, as if he were destructive of the rest of mankind. In the present crisis, however, the highly educated Negroes find very little to exploit, and in their untoward condition, they have no program of finding a way out. They see numerous instances of Negroes losing their jobs in white establishments. In fact, these things occur daily. Janitors who have been giving satisfaction are abruptly told that they will no longer be needed. Negro waiters in hotels are being informed that their places will go to white workers. Negro truck drivers are ordered to step down and let the needy of the other race go up. We hear so much of this that we wonder what the outcome will be. In this readjustment, of course, when there are fewer opportunities left for those who cannot or do not have the opportunity to operate machines, the Negroes will naturally be turned out of their positions by their employers who think first of their own race. In the ultimate passing of the Depression, however, Negroes will not be much better off when some of the whites now displacing them will rise to higher levels. In the economic order of tomorrow, there will be little use for the factotum or scullion. Man will not need such personal attention when he can buy a machine to serve him more efficiently. The menial Negroes, the aggregate of parasites whom the highly educated Negro has exploited, will not be needed on tomorrow. What then will become of our highly educated Negroes who have no initiative? We have appealed to the talented tenth for a remedy, but they have nothing to offer. Their minds have never functioned in this all-important sphere. The educated Negro shows no evidence of vision. He should see a new picture. The Negroes are facing the alternative of rising in the sphere of production to supply their proportion of the manufacturers and merchants, or of going down to the graves of paupers. The Negro must now do for himself or die out as the world undergoes readjustment. If the whites are to continue for some time in doing drudgery to the exclusion of Negroes, the latter must find another way out. Nothing forces this upon one more dramatically than when he learns that white women in Montgomery, Alabama, are coming to the back door of Negro homes asking for their washing. If the whites have reached this extremity, and they must be taken care of first, what will be left for the Negroes? At this moment, then, the Negroes must begin to do the very thing which they have been taught that they cannot do. They still have some money, and they have needs to supply. They must begin immediately to pool their earnings and organize industries to participate in supplying social and economic demands. If the Negroes are to remain forever removed from the producing atmosphere, and the present discrimination continues, there will be nothing left for them to do. There is no reason for lack of confidence because of the recent failure of Negro enterprises, although the highly educated Negroes assert the contrary. This lack of confidence is the cause of the failure of these enterprises. If the Negroes had manifested enough confidence in them and had properly supported them, they would have been strong enough to stand the test in the crisis. Negro banks, as a rule, have failed because the people, taught that their own pioneers in business cannot function in this sphere, withdrew their deposits. An individual cannot live after you extract the blood from his veins. The strongest bank in the United States will last only so long as the people will have sufficient confidence in it to keep their money there. In fact, the confidence of the people is worth more than money. The lack of confidence of the Negro in himself and in his possibilities is what has kept him down. His miseducation has been a perfect success in this respect. Yet, it is not necessary for the Negro to have more confidence in his own workers than in others. If the Negro would be as fair to his own as he has been to others, this would be all that is necessary to give him a new lease on life and start the trend upward. Here we find that the Negro has failed to recover from his slavish habit of berating his own and worshiping others as perfect beings. No progress has been made in this respect because the more education the Negro gets, the worse off he is. He has just had so much longer to learn to decry and despise himself. The race looking to this educated class for a solution of its problems does not find any remedy, and on the contrary sees itself further and further away from those things to which it has aspired. By forgetting the schoolroom for the time being and relying upon an awakening of the masses through adult education, we can do much to give the Negro a new point of view with respect to economic enterprise and group cooperation. The average Negro has not been sufficiently miseducated to become hopeless. Our minds must become sufficiently developed to use segregation to kill segregation, and thus bring to pass that ancient and yet modern prophecy, quote, "The wrath of man shall praise thee," end quote. If the Negro in the ghetto must eternally be fed by the hand that pushes him into the ghetto, he will never become strong enough to get out of the ghetto. This assumption of Negro leadership in the ghetto, then, must not be confined to matters of religion, education, and social uplift. It must deal with such fundamental forces in life as make these things possible. If the Negro area, however, is to continue as a district supported wholly from without, the inept dwellers therein will merit and will receive only the contempt of those who may occasionally catch glimpses of them in their plight. As Frederick Douglass said in 1852, quote, "It is vain that we talk of being men if we do not the work of men. We must become valuable to society in other departments of industry than those servile ones from which we are rapidly being excluded. We must show that we can do as well as they, when we can build as well as live in houses, when we can make as well as wear shoes, when we can produce as well as consume wheat, corn, and rye, then we shall become valuable to society." Society, continued Douglass, is a hard-hearted affair. With it, the helpless may expect no higher dignity than that of paupers. The individual must lay society under obligation to him, or society will honor him only as a stranger and sojourner.